Welcome. What you are about to hear is not background noise from a distant diplomatic dispute. This is the story of two nations, neighbors for over a century, economic partners for decades, bound together by the world's largest bilateral trading relationship, tearing apart at the seams. And at the center of it all is a phone call, a social media post, a broken deadline, and a deeper question that neither Washington nor Ottawa has yet answered. What happens when the most integrated economic partnership on Earth starts to unravel in real time? Let us begin at the beginning because context is everything in a story this complex. On February 1st, 2025, the trade war began. U.S. President Donald Trump signed orders imposing near-universal tariffs on goods from Canada and Mexico. The order called for 25% tariffs on all imports from Canada, with energy and potash taxed at 10%. That single stroke of the pen triggered what would become the most consequential disruption to North American trade in the post-NAFTA era. Then Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would retaliate with 25% tariffs on 30 billion Canadian dollars worth of American goods, with plans to expand to 155 billion Canadian dollars after 3 weeks. However, on February 3rd, one day before they were set to take effect, both leaders negotiated a 1-month delay. That delay was the first signal of something important. Both sides were willing to pull back from the brink, at least temporarily. But the delay did not hold. The tariff war resumed, escalated, and eventually consumed the bilateral relationship entirely. And to understand how that happened, you need to understand the man who stepped into the middle of it. On March 9th, Mark Carney won the Liberal Party leadership election to succeed Trudeau as Canadian Prime Minister. In his acceptance speech, he said that he supported the Trudeau government's retaliatory tariffs and that his government would keep them in place until the Americans show us respect. As Prime Minister-designate, he called Trump's threats to impose tariffs on dairy and metals an attack on Canadian workers, families, and businesses. Carney was not your typical politician riding into office on rhetoric alone. This was a man who had served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis, then as governor of the Bank of England during Brexit. He understood systemic risk. He understood how quickly economic confidence can collapse. And now he was walking into perhaps the most consequential trade confrontation Canada had faced in its modern history. Carney and Trump spoke directly for the first time in a phone call on March 28th. Carney called the call very cordial and substantial and said that Trump respected Canada's sovereignty. Trump described his call as extremely productive and said that he and Carney agree on many things. Trump referred to Carney as the Prime Minister of Canada, whereas he had addressed Trudeau as the Governor of Canada as a U.S. state. That distinction was not trivial. It was a signal that the relationship had been reset, at least in tone. But tone and policy are entirely different things. Both leaders agreed to start comprehensive negotiations about a new economic and security relationship between Canada and the United States after the Canadian federal election on April 28th. Canada voted. Carney won. And the negotiations were supposed to begin in earnest. Now let us examine what was actually at stake, because the numbers tell a story that words alone cannot capture. According to Statistics Canada data for 2025, Canada exported 73% of its goods to and imported 46% of its goods from the United States. Think about that for a moment. Nearly 3/4 of everything Canada produces and sells goes to one country, one neighbor, one president's signature. That level of dependency is not just an economic fact. It is a structural vulnerability of enormous proportions. Canada is the largest supplier of U.S. energy imports, including crude oil, natural gas, and electricity. Canada's share of U.S. crude oil imports by quantity increased from 41% in 2015 to 64% in 2025. The United States, in other words, is not just Canada's largest customer. The U.S. is deeply reliant on Canada in ways that the average American consumer has never been asked to think about. In 2025, the United States imposed duties on about 13% of U.S. imports from Canada, worth about $50.5 billion total. Most Canadian goods entered duty-free because goods were certified as USMCA compliant, but the sectors that were hit, steel, aluminum, automobiles, copper, were not minor footnotes. They were pillars of Canadian industrial employment. The looming car tariffs were expected to affect 500,000 Canadian jobs, 500,000 people, and the pain was spreading far beyond factory floors. From January to April 2025, Canadian exports to the United States decreased by 26%. The decline was striking. In 2024, 75.9% of Canadian exports went to the United States each month on average, but by May 2025, the share had declined to 68.3%, one of the lowest on record. Canada lost an estimated 54,000 manufacturing jobs from January to May 2025, pushing the unemployment rate to 7%, its highest since 2016, excluding pandemic years. According to Yale's Budget Lab, Canada's long-run real GDP is down 2.1% since tariffs and retaliatory tariffs began, the sharpest decline of any U.S. trading partner. Pause on that. The sharpest decline of any U.S. trading partner. Not China, which absorbed Trump's most aggressive tariff campaign, not Mexico. Canada, America's closest ally, its largest energy supplier, the country with which it shares the longest undefended border in the world, suffered the most. Canada's Export Credit Agency slashed its forecast for annual GDP growth from 1.8% to 0.9%. Stuart Bergman, chief economist at Export Development Canada, said, EDC Economics expects Canada to fall into recession in 2025. Official figures showed Canada's real GDP slumped by 0.4% in the second quarter as exports slumped and business investment declined. Against this backdrop of economic deterioration, the diplomatic calendar was moving in parallel, with a series of deadlines, promises, collapses, and restarts that would have been almost farcical if the stakes were not so devastating for real people. At the G7 summit in Kananaskis in June 2025, Carney and Trump agreed to resume negotiations. Canada and the U.S. had jointly announced plans to reach a deal within 30 days, aiming for a July 21st timeline. But before that deadline could even arrive, the first major rupture occurred. President Trump said he was suspending trade talks with Canada over its plans to continue with a 3% digital services tax on U.S. technology firms, which he called a direct and blatant attack on our country. The digital services tax was due to hit companies including Amazon, Google, Meta, Uber, and Airbnb. Canada blinked. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said late Sunday trade talks had resumed after Canada rescinded its plan to tax U.S. technology firms. Carney and Trump spoke on the phone Sunday, and Carney's office said they agreed to resume negotiations. But here is what that moment revealed about the power dynamics at play. Daniel Bayland, a political science professor at McGill University, called Carney's retreat a clear victory for Trump. President Trump forced PM Carney to do exactly what big tech wanted. U.S. tech executives will be very happy with this outcome, Bayland said. He added that it makes Carney look vulnerable to President Trump's outbursts. This is a critical analytical point. Every time Canada capitulated, and it capitulated more than once, it signaled to the White House that pressure worked. And every time pressure worked, the incentive to apply more pressure increased. This is the structural logic of coercive bargaining, and it was playing out between two democracies who are supposed to be foundational allies. The negotiations resumed, limped forward, and arrived at the next deadline, August 1st, 2025. August 1st, 2025 was set as the deadline for a new trade deal between Canada and the U.S., with the U.S. warning that failure to secure a deal would result in higher tariffs on Canadian goods. With no trade agreement concluded by this deadline, several changes were made to the tariffs applied to goods flowing between Canada and the U.S. Trump signed an executive order increasing tariffs on Canadian goods to 35% from 25% on all products not covered by the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. Federal Cabinet Minister Dominic LeBlanc, in charge of U.S. trade relations, said Canada had always made clear it would only accept a good deal. At the end of business yesterday, that agreement was not yet in sight. There remain sectors the Americans are targeting which are essential for the Canadian economy, he told public broadcaster Radio Canada. The doors aren't closed, the doors are open, the conversations are ongoing. This is the language of a negotiator trying to project strength while absorbing punishment. LeBlanc's words were calibrated, firm enough to satisfy the Canadian public, vague enough to keep the table open. But the reality on the ground was increasingly grim. In July, Trump raised border-related tariffs to 35% on virtually all Canadian exports not compliant with the Canada-US-Mexico agreement. Additional tariffs also targeted Canadian steel, aluminum, automobiles, and copper, triggering economic disruptions on both sides of the border. The tariffs were introduced under the pretext of curbing drug trafficking, despite Canadian officials noting that more narcotics were intercepted coming from the United States than moving in the opposite direction. That last detail deserves full attention. The fentanyl justification, the legal and political foundation for the original tariffs under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, was empirically challenged by Canada's own border data. Canada was intercepting more drugs flowing south from the U.S. than it was sending north. The pretext was not just thin. By Canada's accounting, it was inverted. As part of Canada's response to U.S. tariffs, the Government of Canada introduced or maintained measures to help mitigate the impact, including the Large Enterprise Tariff Loan, managed by the Canada Development Investment Corporation, the Pivot to Grow initiative by the Business Development Bank of Canada, and programs to help businesses in agri-food industries manage financial challenges. U.S. tariffs had a near-immediate impact on jobs in directly affected industries. Businesses subject to tariffs know that U.S. demand for their products will be lower, and they cut jobs. Canadian exports were growing in 2024 as the global economic recovery gained momentum. The Bank of Canada had forecast goods exports would grow roughly 2.5% in 2025 and 3.5% in 2026. That all changed with the inauguration of President Trump. Following the collapse of the August 1st deadline, Canada and the U.S. entered a new and more uncertain phase. Talks did not formally break down, but they produced nothing. August passed, September arrived, and then came October. On October 7, 2025, Trump met Carney in the Oval Office. It appeared to be a warmer moment, brief signs of diplomatic thawing. But it did not last. On October 23rd, President Donald Trump said he was terminating trade talks with Canada, effective immediately. Trump accused Canada of trying to interfere with an upcoming Supreme Court case about the legality of his reciprocal tariffs. Trump made the announcement on Truth Social after the Canadian province of Ontario began running a television advertisement in the United States, featuring a speech from former President Ronald Reagan. Trump posted on his social media site, "Tariffs are very important to the national security and economy of the USA. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated." What was the ad? The ad, which Ontario's Premier Doug Ford posted on X, begins with Reagan saying, "When someone says, 'Let's impose tariffs on foreign imports,' it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs, and sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. But over the long run, such trade barriers hurt every American worker and consumer," Reagan continues. Ontario Premier Doug Ford had recently said Ontario would spend $75 million to run ads in the United States featuring Reagan criticizing tariffs. Think about this. A Canadian provincial government was running ads on American television during American programming, using the recorded voice of a beloved Republican president to tell American voters that Trump's tariffs were bad for them. The political audacity was remarkable. The response was predictable. Trump said he was terminating trade negotiations with Canada in response to a negative TV advertisement about tariffs. Tariffs are very important to the national security and economy of the USA. Based on their egregious behavior, all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated, Trump posted. Kevin Hassett, director of the National Economic Council, was asked about Trump's cancellation on Friday morning. Obviously, the president truthed something that reveals his frustration with the actions and postures of the Canadians through months of negotiations, and we'll see how it goes, Hassett said. I think the frustration has built up over time. I've been involved in some of these negotiations, and the Canadians have been very difficult to negotiate with. On Friday, Ontario Premier Doug Ford said that after speaking with Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, the U.S. ad campaign would pause on Monday so that trade talks can resume, but not before it ran during MLB's World Series games over the weekend. Let us be precise about what this episode reveals. The United States and Canada, two of the world's most sophisticated democracies, partners in NATO, co-signatories to USMCA, neighbors across the longest undefended border on Earth, had their formal trade negotiations terminated because of a television advertisement. Not because of a tariff violation, not because of a border security breakdown, because of an ad. A Canadian province ran a Ronald Reagan speech on American TV, and the President of the United States responded by declaring all trade talks dead. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney has sought to take a tough line against U.S. protectionism, but his country is highly dependent on its giant neighbor to the south. The last time Trump suspended trade talks with Ottawa, in June, over a digital tax on U.S. tech companies, Canadian authorities quickly withdrew the measure. This is the central strategic dilemma Canada faces. To resist is to risk economic suffocation. To capitulate is to signal weakness and invite further coercion. There is no clean path. Carney knew this when he took office. He said as much. The jobs of workers in our industries most affected by U.S. tariffs, autos, steel, lumber, are under threat. Our businesses are holding back investments, restrained by the pall of uncertainty that is hanging over all of us, Carney said. I will always be straight about the challenges we have to face and the choices we must make. To be clear, we won't transform our economy easily or in a few months. It will take some sacrifices and some time. According to Carney, the decades-long process of an ever closer economic relationship between the Canadian and U.S. economies is now over. That is an extraordinary statement, not a negotiating tactic, not campaign rhetoric. A formal declaration from the sitting Prime Minister of Canada that the economic integration model of the past 40 years is finished. Carney set a goal for Canada to double its non-U.S. exports in the next decade, saying American tariffs are causing a chill in investment, just as slower growth and job losses have hit the smaller Canadian economy, so they will hit the massive U.S. one. The difference, while the impact is evident in Canada, which is already seeing job losses and flirting with recession, in the U.S. the trade war hit is still largely hidden. This asymmetry, Canada bleeding visibly while the U.S. absorbs pain invisibly, is a crucial political dynamic. It allows the Trump administration to maintain that tariffs are working, while the downstream effects on American consumers, supply chains, and manufacturing costs accumulate quietly in corporate balance sheets and grocery receipts. When carmaker Stellantis announced that it would move a major plant from Ontario to Illinois, costing the province some 3,000 jobs, the Canadian government responded by limiting how many cars Stellantis and General Motors can import into Canada tariff-free. Trump has canceled all trade negotiations with Canada and said he is slapping a further 10% tariff or tax on Canadian exports to the U.S. Trump failed to provide the barest of details about the new 10% tariff that he announced, including when it will come into force and what goods will be subjected to it. Citing Canada's NATO commitments and Trump's threats, Carney announced an immediate $9.2 billion or 17% increase in military spending. At the NATO Leaders Summit, he pledged Ottawa will triple its military expenditures to 5% of GDP, or more than $150 billion per year by 2035. Stop there. Canada's military spending, as a percentage of GDP, has historically hovered around 1 to 1.3%, pledging to reach 5%, 3 times the NATO standard of 2%, and among the highest defense spending ratios of any democratic country on Earth, is not a minor adjustment. It is a fundamental reorientation of national economic priorities driven entirely by the breakdown of trust with a neighbor and ally. As the U.S. ambassador to Canada claimed negotiations to end tariffs on Canadian exports have completely halted since the fall of 2025, Prime Minister Mark Carney's plan to court $1 trillion in investment by 2030 hangs in the balance. business leaders and economists are stressing the vital importance of the continuity of CUSMA for investment. The lion's share, 71.7%, of all Canadian merchandise exports headed south in 2025, despite tariffs reducing the overall share. The two countries, along with Mexico, are also scheduled to engage in a review of USMCA in July 2026, which could lead to significant changes in the agreement. Congress implemented USMCA through legislation and may need to approve revisions. That review is now approaching in a climate of broken trust, terminated negotiations, and escalating tariff walls. The stakes could not be higher. Both sides have agreed to negotiate on a new economic and security framework, though specifics remain unclear. Direct talks continue, but no comprehensive agreement resolving tariff disputes has been announced. Where does that leave us? It leaves us in a moment of profound geopolitical ambiguity. Two countries whose economies are so deeply fused that, as the Bank of Canada noted, changes in U.S. trade policy have caused shifts in Canadian trade across two dimensions simultaneously, are now navigating a relationship that neither side's institutions were built to manage in its current fractured form. Canadians remain perplexed by their treatment and repeated calls by Trump to annex their country, frustration that has bubbled into broader efforts to revisit Canada's ties with the U.S. Canada challenged U.S. trade actions on steel, aluminum, and the fentanyl tariffs at the World Trade Organization. The persistent trade drama and U.S. unwillingness to distinguish between friends and adversaries have prompted deeper reflection on the bilateral relationship. Both Canadians across the political spectrum and Canadian society at large have grown concerned over threats from the United States. Canadian politicians have a motive to push back immediately and forcefully against Trump because of the threats to Canadian sovereignty. The trade war also increased support for the removal of trade barriers between Canada's provinces. There is an irony buried in that last point that history will likely record with some astonishment. The Trump tariff war, designed to pressure Canada into submission, has instead accelerated Canada's internal economic integration and hardened Canadian nationalism to a degree not seen in decades. Following the August collapse, Carney initiated a call with Trump, marking their first direct conversation since negotiations fell apart. According to a statement from the Prime Minister's office, the leaders engaged in a productive and wide-ranging conversation discussing current trade challenges, economic opportunities, and shared priorities. Carney also raised the prospect of establishing a new economic and security framework between Canada and the United States. Productive and wide-ranging, that is diplomatic language for, we talked, nothing was resolved, but we're still talking. When the most powerful trading relationship in human history is described in terms that a press office chooses carefully to avoid saying what actually happened, you know the situation is serious. What is the analytical conclusion? This is not simply a trade dispute. It is a recalibration of power and dependency in North America. Canada entered 2025 with nearly 3/4 of its exports going to one country. It is attempting, under enormous economic duress, to break that dependency, to diversify, to invest in Europe, Asia, and other partners, to rebuild what Carney calls economic sovereignty. Whether it succeeds will depend on decisions made not just in Ottawa, but in Brussels, Tokyo, London, and New Delhi. The United States, for its part, is discovering, slowly and mostly without media coverage that matches the scale of the issue, that its supply chains for energy, steel, aluminum, and automotive components run directly through the country it has chosen to treat as an adversary. The pain is deferred, but not eliminated. It is accumulating. Prices for home appliances, cars, and auto parts could be impacted by President Donald Trump's decision to end trade talks between the U.S. and Canada, some trade experts told ABC News. The breakdown of these talks about current tariffs probably doesn't bode well for those negotiations, said Tyler Schiffer, a professor of economics at the University of St. Thomas. The USMCA review in July 2026 is approaching fast. It will be conducted by negotiators on both sides who have spent the better part of a year watching deals collapse over digital services taxes, Ronald Reagan advertisements, and social media posts. The institutional trust that any successful trade negotiation depends upon has been severely damaged. Rebuilding it will not be a matter of a single phone call, no matter how productive and wide-ranging the press office describes it. Here is the final analytical frame. Canada is not a small country. It is the second largest country on Earth by landmass. It is a G7 economy. It is the largest foreign supplier of energy to the United States. It is a NATO ally. It has nuclear-capable infrastructure. Arctic sovereignty claims that matter enormously to global security, and a sophisticated industrial base. And yet it has been treated, by the rhetoric and the policy of the Trump administration, as a subordinate, a province, a problem to be managed rather than a partner to be respected. Carney's response has been to refuse that framing while absorbing the economic blow. Whether Canada can outlast the pressure, whether its economy can survive the transition from U.S. dependency to genuine diversification before the social and political costs become unbearable, is the central question of Canadian governance in this decade. Many of Canada's former strengths, based on close ties to America, have become vulnerabilities. That sentence, spoken by Canada's own Prime Minister, should be inscribed somewhere as the defining epitaph for what was once called the world's most successful bilateral relationship. The talks erupted, the calls ended abruptly, the deadlines passed, the tariffs rose, the jobs disappeared, and two countries that built a century of shared prosperity together are now, carefully and painfully, learning to exist in something that looks far less like partnership and far more like managed estrangement. This story is not over. The USMCA review of 2026 is the next inflection point. The outcome of American courts reviewing the legality of Trump's tariff mechanisms matters. The Canadian economy's trajectory into or out of recession matters. What European and Asian markets decide to offer Canada as alternatives matters. And what American voters eventually think about the cost of all of this when it finally shows up in their prices and their paychecks will matter most of all. We are watching in real time the remaking of North America's economic architecture. And the question is whether what comes next will be built on something more durable than what just collapsed.